she said, "Just don't post any photos of us tonight." I watched Rachel apply her makeup with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation, each stroke of mascara deliberate and calculated, each adjustment to her emerald dress strategic and purposeful, like she was suiting up for battle. She'd been getting ready for 3 hours in our lakefront apartment overlooking Chicago's Gold Coast, transforming our shared bedroom into a makeshift salon with curling irons heating up on every available surface, foundation bottles arranged like expensive ammunition across our oak dresser, and beauty tools scattered everywhere like instruments of carefully planned seduction. The emerald dress hung on our bedroom door like a flag of conquest, what she called her hunting outfit, when she thought I wasn't listening to her hushed phone conversations with her sister Emma about which outfit would drive men absolutely wild with uncontrollable desire. I was sitting on the edge of our Italian leather couch, the expensive one we'd picked out together last spring at that furniture showroom in River North when we were still planning our future like we actually had a real one worth building. Watching her prepare for what I naively assumed was just another night out in downtown Chicago with her marketing colleagues from the prestigious advertising firm where she worked as a creative director crafting campaigns for luxury brands. That seemingly casual request she dropped while applying her third coat of lipstick would completely shatter everything I thought I knew about where I stood in her life and what our supposedly solid relationship actually meant to her after 2 years of what I believed was genuine partnership. I'm a marine biologist who spends my professional days studying the complex migration patterns of Great Lakes fish populations, someone who makes a living meticulously observing animal behaviors in their natural environments and drawing scientifically sound conclusions from subtle environmental changes and behavioral shifts, so I should have recognized the glaring warning signs that had been building steadily for months, probably longer if I'm being completely honest with myself, but love has this absolutely devastating way of making even the most analytically minded people willfully blind to uncomfortable patterns that would be obvious in any other context. As she slipped into that emerald dress that clung to every curve of her carefully maintained figure and left absolutely nothing to imagination, strategically cut to showcase the body she maintained through expensive personal training sessions at an exclusive gym that I helped pay for with my research grant money, I asked her directly why she didn't want me to post any photos of us together on social media, thinking maybe she was worried about maintaining her carefully curated professional image. Or didn't want work colleagues seeing her party lifestyle since her company had recently implemented strict social media guidelines for employees. That's when she explained to me, using the same casual, matter-of-fact tone she'd used to discuss what we should order for dinner delivery or whether we needed to stop by the grocery store to pick up essentials, that her ex-boyfriend Connor might be at the exclusive rooftop club tonight and she wanted him to think she was completely single and available for whatever romantic possibilities might develop between them during the evening. The words hit me like diving headfirst into Lake Michigan during a January blizzard, that shocking, breathtaking cold that makes your entire nervous system recoil in self-protection. But she continued applying her expensive designer lipstick with steady hands as if she hadn't just casually asked me to become completely invisible so she could openly flirt with another man right in front of our mutual friends who knew about our relationship. I sat there in stunned silence, processing the full implications of what she'd actually requested, the reality crashing over me like powerful waves against the lakefront breakwall during a storm, slowly realizing that in Rachel's carefully constructed mental hierarchy of relationships and priorities, our 2-year partnership was something embarrassing to hide rather than something to proudly display, that I represented nothing more than the comfortable safety net while Connor embodied the excitement, passion, and external validation she truly craved from her romantic life. She turned to face me directly with that practiced, devastatingly beautiful smile that had first completely captivated me during our initial date at that upscale seafood restaurant near Navy Pier where she charmed me with stories about her ambitious career goals, asking sweetly if I understood and supported her request as if she was explaining something perfectly reasonable rather than asking me to actively collaborate in making myself disappear for her romantic convenience. The moment crystallized something profound that I'd been desperately trying to ignore for months. The way she consistently treated our relationship like a comfortable insurance policy rather than something she genuinely treasured and wanted to nurture and protect, how she invariably described me to her friends as Derek's really stable and reliable and dependable, rather than using words like amazing or incredible or Derek makes me incredibly happy or anything that suggested genuine romantic passion or deep emotional connection. I found myself studying her beautiful face as she checked her reflection one final time in our hallway mirror, the same mirror where we used to take countless selfies together during happier times when she actually seemed proud to be seen with me, seeing not the woman I'd fallen so deeply in love with but someone who fundamentally viewed me as a resource to be managed and strategically deployed rather than a true partner to be cherished, respected, and honored. She kissed me goodbye with lips that tasted like expensive gloss and naked ambition, telling me sweetly not to wait up because she'd probably be out very late doing important networking with industry contacts. Though we both understood exactly what kind of networking she had in mind with Connor and what she desperately hoped might develop from their inevitable encounter at the club. The moment Rachel's Uber disappeared around the corner toward downtown Chicago, heading to that exclusive rooftop club where she planned to pretend I didn't exist, I experienced the most profound moment of clarity I'd had in our entire 2-year relationship, like suddenly seeing the lake bottom through water that had been murky for months. I stood at our floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago shoreline, watching the city lights reflect off Lake Michigan's dark surface, and understood with absolute scientific certainty that I was looking at my life from the perspective of someone who had been relegated to the role of backup plan, safety net, and convenient financial contributor rather than cherished partner in a woman's romantic adventure. The revelation wasn't painful anymore, just clinically clear. The way identifying a contaminated water sample becomes obvious once you know what markers to look for under the microscope. I walked through our apartment methodically, seeing everything with fresh eyes, noting how many of our shared possessions were things Rachel had chosen while I'd simply paid for them, how the entire space reflected her aesthetic preferences while my own personality had been gradually edited out like an unwelcome element in her carefully curated lifestyle magazine spread. The Italian leather furniture, the abstract art pieces that cost more than most people's monthly salary, the kitchen appliances we'd never used because Rachel preferred expensive takeout, all of it suddenly felt like props in someone else's life rather than genuine expressions of our partnership. I began packing with the same methodical precision I used when preparing for extended research expeditions, moving through our shared space like a scientist cataloging specimens, carefully separating my belongings from the material evidence of our doomed relationship with surgical accuracy and emotional detachment that surprised me with its completeness and clarity. My grandfather's vintage Leica camera, the one he'd used to document his own marine biology research in the 1960s and had passed down to me before his death, went into my equipment case first, wrapped carefully in the same protective cloth he'd shown me how to use when I was 12 years old and first developing my passion for underwater photography. The camera represented everything Rachel had never understood about my connection to family legacy and scientific tradition, something she'd always dismissed as old-fashioned when I tried to explain why it meant more to me than any expensive modern equipment money could buy. I packed my collection of research journals next, leather-bound notebooks filled with years of field observations, sketches of fish species, water temperature readings, and behavioral patterns I'd documented during countless hours spent studying Great Lakes ecosystems that had always fascinated me far more than Rachel's endless social events ever could. These journals contain my real life's work, the foundation of research papers I hope to publish someday, data that could contribute to conservation efforts protecting the aquatic environments I devoted my career to understanding and preserving. My custom wetsuit came next, the one I'd saved for months to purchase from my research grant money, designed specifically for cold water diving in the Great Lakes where I conducted most of my field work during summer months when Rachel complained constantly about my absence from her social calendar. The wetsuit represented freedom to me, hours spent exploring underwater worlds where the only sounds were my own breathing and the gentle movement of water currents, places where Rachel's drama and manipulation couldn't reach me and I could focus entirely on the scientific work that genuinely excited and fulfilled me. I methodically packed my diving equipment, each piece representing investments in my true passions rather than the expensive lifestyle accessories Rachel had convinced me we needed to maintain our social status among her marketing executive friends who measured worth entirely by visible consumption and brand recognition. The underwater photography gear filled an entire case, specialized cameras and lighting equipment I'd accumulated over years of careful purchases, tools that allowed me to document the hidden beauty of aquatic ecosystems that most people never had the privilege to witness firsthand. My extensive library required careful packing, marine biology textbooks that had guided my education and career development, field identification guides for Great Lakes fish species, and scientific journals containing research papers that had inspired my own work and methodology. Rachel had always complained that these books made our apartment look too academic rather than stylish for the Instagram photos she constantly posted, suggesting repeatedly that I should store them elsewhere so our living space would photograph better for her social media presence. Each book represented knowledge and passion that had shaped my identity long before I'd met Rachel, intellectual pursuits she'd never shown genuine interest in despite my numerous attempts over the years to share my enthusiasm for marine conservation and aquatic research. I carefully removed my clothes from our walk-in closet, leaving behind the expensive suits and designer casual wear Rachel had insisted I purchase for her work events and social gatherings, keeping only the practical clothing that reflected who I actually was when I wasn't performing the role of her respectable boyfriend for appearances. The expensive clothes had always felt like costumes anyway, uncomfortable reminders that Rachel was embarrassed by my natural preferences for practical, functional clothing that could withstand field research conditions rather than impressing people at pretentious networking events I'd never enjoyed attending. My laptop and computer equipment required special protection during transport, containing years of research data, field notes, photographs, and partially completed papers that represented my genuine career aspirations and scientific contributions. Rachel had never understood why I spent so much time organizing and backing up this data, viewing my meticulous record-keeping as obsessive rather than recognizing it as essential professional practice for serious scientific research that could potentially impact conservation policy and environmental protection efforts. The process of packing became a ritual of self-reclamation, each item I carefully placed in boxes or cases representing a piece of my authentic identity that I was taking back from a relationship where I'd gradually lost myself trying to meet someone else's impossible standards and constantly shifting expectations. I found myself working with calm efficiency rather than emotional distress, as if my scientific training had kicked in to help me approach this life transition with the same objectivity I'd use when conducting field research or analyzing data for publication. I left behind the expensive dinnerware Rachel had selected, the luxury bedding she'd insisted we needed for our bedroom to look sophisticated, and the designer furniture that had always felt more like museum pieces than comfortable living space where a person could relax and be themselves. These items had never reflected my preferences or values anyway, serving primarily as expensive props in Rachel's carefully constructed image of successful urban lifestyle that she maintained primarily for social media documentation and competitive comparison with her colleagues and friends. My diving gear filled 2 large duffel bags, my camera equipment required its own protective case with foam padding, and my research materials needed 3 sturdy boxes with proper labeling, all of it representing the person I'd been before Rachel gradually convinced me that my natural interests weren't sophisticated or lucrative enough for her upscale lifestyle aspirations. The apartment looked increasingly hollow and impersonal as I systematically removed all traces of my presence, leaving behind a space that perfectly reflected Rachel's aesthetic vision but contained none of the warmth, intellectual curiosity, or genuine personality that makes a house feel like an actual home rather than an expensive showpiece designed primarily for external validation. I packed my small collection of sentimental items last, including framed photos of my parents and grandparents, the collection of unique rocks and shells I'd gathered during research expeditions to remote Great Lakes locations, and the handwritten letters my grandfather had sent me during my graduate studies, each piece carrying emotional significance that had nothing whatsoever to do with impressing anyone or maintaining a certain image for social media purposes. I loaded my SUV under the cover of darkness around midnight, working methodically in the underground parking garage while Chicago slept above me, carrying box after box and bag after bag that contained the genuine pieces of my life rather than the expensive accessories that had decorated Rachel's fantasy. The parking garage felt like a sanctuary, quiet and practical, free from the pretentious atmosphere that had gradually suffocated our apartment over the months as Rachel filled it with increasingly expensive decorations that served no purpose beyond impressing her social media followers and competitive colleagues from the advertising world. I arranged everything in my vehicle with the same careful organization I'd use for a scientific expedition, securing fragile equipment and ensuring nothing would shift during transport, taking satisfaction in the practical efficiency of packing my own possessions rather than the endless consumer purchases Rachel had insisted we needed to maintain our sophisticated image. My grandfather's Leica camera rode in the front seat beside me, wrapped safely in its protective cloth, a tangible connection to family heritage and scientific tradition that Rachel had never understood or appreciated despite my attempts to explain its emotional and historical significance. I left a simple note on the kitchen counter, written on plain paper with my everyday pen rather than the expensive stationery Rachel kept for what she called important correspondence, containing just 8 words that captured everything I wanted her to understand about the natural consequences of her request. The note read: "Mission accomplished. No more acting required." In my neat handwriting, concise and direct without drama or lengthy explanations that would only give her material to twist into some narrative where I was the villain in her romantic story. I didn't want to engage in emotional manipulation or lengthy justifications that would provide her with ammunition for the victim narrative she'd inevitably construct when she discovered the results of her calculated decision to treat our relationship as something embarrassing to hide. The drive to the boutique hotel I'd selected near Lake Michigan took only 15 minutes through the quiet late-night streets, past the expensive restaurants and bars where Rachel was probably still pretending to be single and available for Connor's attention, past the world of superficial networking and image management that had gradually consumed our relationship until nothing authentic remained. I'd chosen this particular hotel specifically because it overlooked the lake where I conducted most of my research, a place that represented my genuine passion and career rather than the expensive lifestyle accessories Rachel had convinced me were necessary for social acceptance among her materialistic social circle. The hotel lobby was understated and comfortable, designed for actual travelers rather than Instagram photo opportunities, staffed by professional people who treated guests with quiet respect rather than the performative friendliness Rachel demanded from service workers at trendy establishments. I checked in using my own credit card, the one I'd kept separate from our joint accounts, feeling a profound sense of relief as I signed my name to paperwork that had nothing to do with maintaining someone else's expensive lifestyle or supporting their romantic manipulation tactics. The room was simple and clean, with a view of Lake Michigan that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with marine biology in the first place, before Rachel convinced me that my natural interests weren't sophisticated enough for her upscale social aspirations and professional networking requirements. I unpacked my immediate necessities, setting up my laptop and camera equipment with the same methodical care I'd use when establishing a field research station, creating a workspace that reflected my authentic priorities rather than someone else's materialistic values and social media image management. The shower felt like a baptism, washing away the residual stress and compromised identity that had accumulated over months of trying to meet Rachel's impossible standards and constantly shifting expectations for how I should dress, speak, and present myself to her competitive social circle. I stood under the hot water for longer than necessary, letting it wash away not just the physical effort of packing and moving, but the emotional exhaustion of maintaining a relationship where I'd gradually lost myself trying to become someone worthy of Rachel's selective affection and conditional approval. When I finally climbed into bed around 2 in the morning, the same time Rachel was probably returning to our empty apartment after her evening of pretending I didn't exist, I experienced the most peaceful sleep I'd had in months, maybe years. The hotel bed was comfortable but unremarkable, nothing like the expensive luxury bedding Rachel had insisted we needed for our bedroom to photograph well for her social media posts. Yet I slept better than I had in our shared apartment where I'd grown accustomed to the constant underlying tension of never quite meeting someone else's standards. My phone sat silent on the nightstand, turned to airplane mode, because I had no interest in witnessing Rachel's immediate reaction to discovering that her comfortable backup plan had taken her request for invisibility literally and permanently. I woke naturally around 7, feeling refreshed and clear-headed in ways I hadn't experienced since the early days of our relationship, Before, Rachel's expectations and criticisms had created a constant background anxiety that I'd learned to accept as normal rather than recognizing as fundamentally unhealthy. My friend Marcus called me the next morning while I was having coffee in the hotel restaurant, and his voice contained barely suppressed laughter as he delivered a detailed report about what had unfolded at the exclusive rooftop club the night before, painting a picture of social disaster that even my scientific imagination couldn't have predicted with all my experience studying animal behaviors and environmental patterns. Marcus worked as a bartender at high-end Chicago establishments and had witnessed Rachel's carefully orchestrated plan collapse in spectacular fashion from his position behind the club's premium cocktail station, where he had a perfect vantage point to observe the complex social dynamics and romantic manipulations that wealthy patrons believed were invisible to service workers who they treated like furniture. According to Marcus, Rachel had made her grand entrance around 10:30, wearing that emerald dress like battle armor and scanning the crowded rooftop with predatory focus until she spotted Connor near the outdoor bar area where Chicago's financial elite gathered to network and display their wealth through expensive bottle service and competitive consumption of overpriced alcohol. Connor looked exactly as I remembered him from Rachel's old photos, tall and conventionally handsome in that generic investment banker way, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent and projecting the kind of confident arrogance that comes from inherited wealth and professional success in manipulating other people's money for personal gain and social status. Rachel had approached him with calculated casualness, ordering an expensive cocktail and positioning herself strategically within his line of sight while pretending to be surprised by their accidental encounter, employing the same strategic flirtation tactics I'd watched her practice in our bathroom mirror for months when she thought I wasn't paying attention to her rehearsals. The initial reconnection had proceeded exactly according to Rachel's fantasy script, with Connor immediately taking notice of her revealing dress and apparent availability, responding to her practiced charm and carefully constructed personality with the kind of superficial interest that wealthy men show toward beautiful women who might enhance their social status or provide entertaining conquest opportunities without emotional complications. They'd moved to a more private section of the rooftop where expensive leather couches created intimate conversation areas overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline, and Rachel had deployed every manipulation technique in her considerable arsenal to capture Connor's attention and rekindle whatever romantic chemistry they'd shared during their previous relationship years earlier when they were both younger and less calculating. Marcus described watching Rachel transform into a completely different person, laughing too loudly at Connor's mediocre jokes, touching his arm with calculated frequency, and gazing into his eyes with the kind of manufactured intensity that suggested desperate need rather than genuine romantic attraction or emotional connection based on shared values or interests. For nearly 2 hours, Rachel's plan appeared to be working perfectly, with Connor responding positively to her obvious availability and seeming genuinely interested in renewing their romantic connection, buying round after round of expensive drinks and engaging in the kind of superficial conversation that passes for meaningful connection among Chicago's social climbing elite and image-conscious professionals who measure worth through external validation. They'd been getting increasingly intimate on the crowded dance floor, with Connor's hands exploring territory that should have belonged exclusively to her supposedly committed boyfriend who was probably waiting at home while she pretended to be single and available for whatever romantic opportunities might develop during the evening. Marcus had a front-row seat to watch Rachel's manipulation tactics in action, seeing how she strategically positioned her body, timed her touches, and modulated her voice to maximize Connor's interest while maintaining plausible deniability about her true intentions if anyone questioned her behavior later or if word got back to her professional network. The chemistry between them seemed genuine from Connor's perspective, as he had no reason to suspect that the beautiful, apparently single woman flirting with him was actually engaged in elaborate deception involving her live-in boyfriend who had no idea his relationship was being sacrificed for her romantic ambitions and social climbing aspirations. Rachel's friend Ashley, who had apparently consumed too many expensive cocktails throughout the evening and lost track of the elaborate deception Rachel was maintaining for Connor's benefit, made the fatal mistake that would destroy everything Rachel had worked so carefully to achieve through months of planning and emotional manipulation of multiple people. Ashley approached them during a particularly intense moment when Connor and Rachel were intimately dancing and enthusiastically mentioned Rachel's live-in boyfriend Derek, who was probably waiting at home wondering when she'd return from her supposed networking event with colleagues from the advertising industry. The transformation in Connor's demeanor was immediate and brutal, according to Marcus, who watched the entire scene unfold from his strategic position behind the bar, where wealthy patrons often revealed their true character when they thought no service workers were paying attention to their private conversations and personal dramas that exposed their moral limitations. Connor had stepped back from Rachel with visible disgust, his expression shifting from romantic interest to cold contempt as he processed the information that the woman he'd been intimately dancing with was essentially cheating on her committed relationship to pursue him, making him an unwitting participant in someone else's romantic deception and emotional manipulation. Rachel had attempted desperate damage control, frantically trying to explain that her relationship with Derek wasn't serious and that she was planning to end it anyway, but Connor had already lost interest in what he now perceived as a complicated situation involving deception and emotional manipulation rather than the uncomplicated conquest he'd been anticipating from an authentically available woman. Connor had delivered a particularly cruel dismissal that Marcus overheard from his position behind the bar, telling Rachel loud enough for nearby patrons to overhear that he wasn't interested in complicated women who lied about their relationship status and that he preferred to pursue genuinely single women rather than getting involved in someone else's messy romantic drama and emotional baggage. He'd immediately walked away and approached a group of authentically single women at the bar, leaving Rachel standing alone on the dance floor in her expensive emerald dress, humiliated and abandoned in front of Chicago's social elite who had witnessed her spectacular rejection and social miscalculation. The story had spread rapidly through the club via social media and whispered conversations, with multiple people posting about the dramatic scene they'd witnessed on Instagram stories and private group chats, turning Rachel's private humiliation into public entertainment for their entire social circle and professional network. Marcus had watched Rachel attempt to salvage her dignity by pretending the rejection didn't matter to her, but her forced smile and increasingly desperate behavior had only made her humiliation more obvious to everyone present, including other potential romantic targets who now viewed her as damaged goods with questionable judgment. She'd spent the remainder of the evening drinking alone at expensive tables, checking her phone constantly for messages that weren't coming and trying to attract the attention of other wealthy men who had already heard about her deception and were avoiding her like a social disease that might contaminate their own reputations. The evening had concluded with Rachel leaving the club around 2 in the morning, visibly intoxicated and emotionally devastated, calling multiple Uber rides that she'd canceled because she couldn't decide whether to go home and face the consequences of her actions or find somewhere else to hide from the reality of her spectacular miscalculation. Marcus finished his report by mentioning that several people at the club had been asking about me, wondering where Rachel's boyfriend was and whether I knew about her behavior, creating additional social complications that would follow Rachel long after her humiliating evening had ended and she discovered what real consequences looked like. The most ironic part, according to Marcus, was that Rachel's manipulation had backfired so completely that she'd achieved the exact opposite of her intended goal, transforming herself from a woman with options into someone who'd burned bridges with both her existing relationship and her potential new one, leaving her worse off than when the evening began. Marcus also mentioned that he'd overheard several other conversations throughout the night where people were discussing Rachel's behavior, with some expressing sympathy for her unknown boyfriend while others speculated about whether this kind of deception was typical behavior for her, creating a narrative that would damage her reputation in social circles where trust and authenticity were supposedly valued despite the superficial nature of most relationships. Over the following week, Rachel's attempts to contact me evolved from tearful voicemails to angry accusations to desperate bargaining, but I maintained complete radio silence from my new temporary apartment overlooking the Chicago River, watching the city's maritime traffic move with the same methodical precision I was applying to rebuilding my life without someone who had treated me like an embarrassing secret. I'd found a furnished studio apartment in a converted warehouse building, nothing fancy but clean and practical, with large windows that provided natural light for reading and a view of the water that reminded me daily of my authentic passions rather than the expensive lifestyle accessories Rachel had convinced me were necessary for social acceptance among her competitive professional circle. Her first voicemail arrived around 4 in the morning the day after her club disaster, her voice raw and shaking as she confessed to finding my note and discovering that I'd removed all my belongings from our shared apartment, apparently having expected me to wait patiently at home for her return like some kind of loyal pet rather than a man with self-respect and options. The message contained the usual manipulation tactics I'd grown accustomed to over our 2 years together, alternating between tears and anger, claiming she loved me and had made a terrible mistake while simultaneously trying to minimize her behavior as a harmless night out with friends rather than the calculated betrayal it actually represented. I listened to the entire message once, noted the familiar pattern of her emotional manipulation, then deleted it and continued with my morning coffee while watching research vessels navigate the river toward Lake Michigan, where I hoped to resume my fieldwork once I'd stabilized my living situation. The second voicemail came that afternoon while I was setting up my home office space, her tone shifting to confused frustration as she demanded to know where I was and why I wasn't answering her calls, apparently unable to process that her request for invisibility had been honored permanently rather than temporarily. She referenced our shared lease and financial obligations, trying to frame my departure as irresponsible abandonment rather than acknowledging that she'd explicitly asked me to pretend our relationship didn't exist for another man's benefit, creating a logical inconsistency that revealed how little thought she'd given to the consequences of her manipulation. By the third day, her messages had evolved into angry accusations about my emotional unavailability and unwillingness to fight for our relationship, a fascinating example of psychological projection given that she was the one who'd actively worked to make me invisible for Connor's benefit. She claimed I was punishing her for one innocent mistake, reframing her calculated deception as a momentary lapse in judgment rather than the result of months of planning and emotional manipulation that had gradually eroded my trust and self-respect. I found her attempts to rewrite history almost scientifically interesting, like watching a specimen try to adapt to an environment that no longer supported its survival strategies, except I had no professional obligation to document her behavioral changes for research purposes. During the fourth day, her strategy shifted to desperate bargaining, promising to change her behavior and prioritize our relationship over her social ambitions, but these promises felt hollow given that she'd had 2 years to demonstrate genuine respect for our partnership and had chosen instead to treat me like a convenient backup plan. Her sister Emma called me directly that evening, using a tone of sisterly authority to explain that I was being too harsh and needed to forgive Rachel's harmless mistake, apparently having received a heavily edited version of events that portrayed Rachel as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own social disaster. I listened politely to Emma's lecture about the importance of communication and compromise in relationships, then calmly explained that Rachel had gotten exactly what she requested from me, which was the freedom to appear single and available without having to acknowledge my existence, and that I'd simply made that arrangement permanent rather than temporary. Emma seemed genuinely surprised by this perspective, suggesting that Rachel had presented our situation as a simple misunderstanding rather than a deliberate manipulation, which confirmed my suspicion that even her closest family members didn't fully understand the calculated nature of her behavior. By the end of the first week, I'd established a routine that felt more authentic and peaceful than anything I'd experienced during the final months of our relationship, waking early to read research journals over coffee, taking long walks along the Riverwalk where I could think clearly without Rachel's constant need for attention and validation, and spending evenings working on scientific papers I'd neglected while managing her emotional demands and social obligations. I'd also reconnected with colleagues from the marine research community, people who shared my genuine interests in Great Lakes ecology and conservation rather than the superficial networking that had dominated our social calendar when Rachel was orchestrating our public appearances for maximum social media impact. The diving club I joined met twice weekly for pool training sessions and weekend trips to various Great Lakes locations, giving me access to the underwater photography opportunities I'd missed while spending weekends at Rachel's expensive social events where I'd felt increasingly out of place among people who measured worth through conspicuous consumption rather than meaningful contribution to scientific knowledge or environmental protection. Each day of silence from Rachel strengthened my resolve and brought me deeper peace, confirming that my decision to honor her request for invisibility permanently rather than temporarily had been the right choice for my emotional well-being and professional development. While her increasingly unhinged messages demonstrated that she was finally experiencing the consequences of treating another person like a disposable resource rather than a cherished partner worthy of respect and genuine affection. 3 weeks later, Rachel tracked me down at my new favorite coffee shop in Lincoln Park. Arriving disheveled and desperate after learning about my new apartment location from a mutual friend who'd apparently felt sorry for her emotional distress and violated the boundary I'd established by keeping my current living situation private from people who might enable her continued manipulation attempts or provide her with ammunition for future guilt trips. I was sitting at a corner table near the large windows reading a fascinating research paper about Great Lakes fish population dynamics and climate change adaptation patterns when she appeared beside my table like a ghost from a life I'd deliberately left behind, wearing rumpled sweatpants and an oversized Northwestern University hoodie instead of her usual carefully coordinated designer outfits, her hair unwashed and tangled, her makeup smudged in ways that suggested she'd been crying recently and hadn't bothered to repair the damage before venturing out in public. The transformation was genuinely startling, seeing someone who'd always prioritized her physical appearance above almost everything else looking like she'd completely given up on maintaining the polished image that had defined her identity and social strategy for as long as I'd known her. But I felt no satisfaction in witnessing her obvious emotional distress because her pain didn't erase the calculated way she'd treated our relationship as something embarrassing to hide when it suited her romantic ambitions and social climbing purposes. She launched into a tearful monologue without waiting for any invitation or acknowledgement from me, explaining in a voice thick with emotion how finding our apartment completely empty of my belongings had been the most devastating and shocking moment of her entire life and how she'd spent the past 3 weeks in a state of constant regret, realizing that I was the best thing that had ever happened to her and that she'd made the worst mistake of her life by taking our relationship for granted. Her words followed the usual script of someone who'd taken a genuinely good situation for granted until it was no longer available for exploitation, filled with promises about how much she'd changed and grown during our brief separation and how desperately she wanted to make things right between us if I'd just give her another chance to prove her commitment to our partnership. Her voice carried that particular desperation of someone who'd never experienced real consequences for their actions before, pleading with me to return to our shared apartment and resume our planned future together as if nothing fundamental had changed between us. As if her explicit request to pretend I didn't exist had been some minor miscommunication rather than a revealing glimpse into how she truly viewed my place in her life and romantic hierarchy. I listened calmly while continuing to sip my coffee and occasionally glance at my research paper, studying her face with the same objective scientific interest I'd use when observing animal behavior under stress, noting how her manipulation tactics had evolved to include more vulnerability and self-deprecation now that her usual confident and controlling approach had proven completely ineffective in getting what she wanted from me. When she finally paused for breath after several minutes of continuous emotional appeals, I set down my coffee cup and explained with surgical precision that she had explicitly asked me to become invisible so she could appear available to another man, and I had simply honored that request permanently by removing myself from the equation rather than subjecting myself to the ongoing humiliation of being her dirty little secret whenever it became convenient for her romantic ambitions. She immediately tried to minimize her request as a moment of temporary insecurity and confusion, claiming she'd been overwhelmed by seeing Connor unexpectedly and hadn't meant to hurt me or make me feel unimportant. But I cut through her revisionist justifications by pointing out that she'd specifically wanted both my emotional and financial stability and Connor's validation and excitement, requiring my active complicity in a deception that reduced me to something shameful to be hidden rather than a partner to be proudly acknowledged and celebrated. The conversation revealed the fundamental disconnect between her perception of relationships as strategic arrangements to be managed for maximum personal benefit versus my understanding of genuine partnership as mutual respect, emotional honesty, and shared commitment to each other's well-being. A philosophical gulf that couldn't be bridged by promises to change behavior that she'd never even recognized as problematic until it resulted in consequences she couldn't manipulate or negotiate away. She attempted to guilt me by describing in dramatic detail how miserable and empty her life had been without me, how our shared apartment felt like a tomb without my presence, how she'd been unable to sleep or eat properly, and how much she'd realized she truly loved me during our separation. But these declarations felt hollow and self-serving because they focused entirely on her own emotional experience rather than acknowledging the impact of her choices on my well-being or demonstrating any genuine understanding of why her behavior had been fundamentally unacceptable. I pointed out that love wasn't just a feeling or emotion but a series of conscious actions and daily choices, and that choosing to ask your committed partner to become invisible for another man's benefit wasn't compatible with any definition of love that included basic respect and consideration for the other person's dignity, self-worth, and emotional needs. Her attempts to reframe the situation and manipulate the narrative became increasingly desperate and incoherent as she realized that her usual emotional manipulation tactics weren't working on someone who'd had 3 weeks of peaceful solitude to process her behavior objectively. Without the immediate emotional pressure and guilt trips she'd always used to avoid taking accountability for her selfish actions and their consequences. She promised through tears that she would never ask anything like that again, would prioritize our relationship over all her social ambitions and networking opportunities, would delete Connor's contact information, would do whatever it took to rebuild my trust and prove her commitment. But these promises felt like desperate negotiations from someone trying to recover a valuable asset rather than genuine expressions of remorse from someone who truly understood the depth of their betrayal and emotional cruelty. I explained patiently that the problem wasn't just her specific request that night, but the entire pattern of behavior it revealed about how she fundamentally viewed me and our relationship, seeing me as someone whose feelings and dignity were automatically secondary to her social climbing ambitions and romantic fantasies about men who represented excitement and external validation rather than the boring stability and genuine care I provided. When she asked desperately what she could possibly do to fix things between us and restore our relationship, I told her calmly that there was actually nothing to fix because nothing was broken from my perspective, that she'd gotten exactly what she'd explicitly asked for and I'd simply made the arrangement permanent instead of temporary, honoring her clearly expressed preference for freedom from having to acknowledge my existence when it interfered with her other romantic pursuits and social opportunities. The logic was irrefutable, even though she clearly hadn't considered the possibility that someone might take her at her word and actually grant her the freedom she'd requested rather than continuing to serve as her backup plan and emotional safety net while she pursued more exciting romantic options with men who excited her in ways I apparently never could. Her final desperate attempt to guilt me involved calling me emotionally unavailable and coldly punishing, accusing me of giving up on us without even trying to work through our problems like mature adults, which only reinforced my decision because it demonstrated that even now, sitting in a coffee shop facing the direct consequences of her calculated actions, she still couldn't take genuine responsibility for creating this entire situation through her own selfish choices and manipulative behavior patterns. She even suggested that we could go to couples counseling to work through our communication issues, as if the problem was that I'd misunderstood her request rather than understanding it perfectly and simply choosing not to participate in my own humiliation any longer than absolutely necessary for my emotional and psychological well-being. I finished the last sip of my coffee, carefully gathered my research papers and laptop, and stood to leave, telling her quietly that I genuinely hoped she found whatever she was actually looking for in life, but that it clearly wasn't the kind of committed partnership I had to offer, and that I was no longer willing to pretend that our fundamental incompatibility regarding respect and honesty could be resolved through better communication or relationship compromise. As I walked away from the coffee shop, leaving her sitting alone at the table where she delivered her desperate final attempt to recover what she'd deliberately thrown away, I felt not anger or sadness but a profound sense of liberation that surprised me with its completeness, confirming that making the right decision often feels peaceful and natural rather than dramatic when you finally stop fighting against obvious reality and accept the truth about what's actually best for your emotional well-being and future happiness. I walked away from the coffee shop confrontation feeling not anger or sadness, but a profound sense of liberation that surprised me with its completeness, like finally surfacing after being underwater for too long and taking that first deep breath of clean air that fills your lungs with relief and possibility. I drove directly to the lakefront where I used to conduct my research, parking near the rocky shoreline where I'd spent countless hours as a graduate student learning about the complex ecosystems that had first drawn me to marine biology before Rachel convinced me that my interests weren't sophisticated enough for her social circle. The sunrise over Lake Michigan was spectacular that morning, painting the water in shades of gold and pink that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this work in the first place, why I'd chosen to dedicate my career to studying these freshwater environments that represented some of the most important ecological systems in North America. I sat on the familiar rocks where I used to eat lunch between diving sessions, watching the gentle waves lap against the shore with rhythmic consistency that had always helped me think clearly about complex problems. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I realized I didn't miss Rachel or our life together at all. I missed the version of myself who could spend entire weekends reading research papers and planning diving expeditions without feeling guilty about not attending expensive social events, who could pursue scientific interests without worrying about whether they were impressive enough for someone else's materialistic standards. The person Rachel had wanted me to be was fundamentally incompatible with who I actually was, which explained why our relationship had felt increasingly exhausting and inauthentic as she'd become more demanding about changing my personality to match her vision of what a successful boyfriend should accomplish. My phone contained one final message from Rachel, sent about an hour after our coffee shop encounter, threatening to make me regret my decision and warning that I'd realize what I'd lost when I was old and alone, but I simply blocked her number and deleted her contact information entirely, removing the last digital connection to someone who'd never really known or appreciated the person I actually was. The threat felt empty and desperate rather than intimidating, coming from someone who'd never understood that being alone with your authentic self is infinitely preferable to being in a relationship where you have to pretend to be someone else for another person's convenience. I drove to my diving club where I'd become a regular member, arriving as my new friends were preparing for a weekend expedition to explore underwater shipwrecks that had been recently discovered by marine archaeologists working with our organization. These people appreciated my expertise and calm presence, valued my knowledge of Great Lakes ecology, and never made me feel like I needed to apologize for being passionate about scientific research rather than expensive restaurants and social networking events. We spent the day diving in crystal clear water 60 feet below the surface, exploring preserved remains of a 19th-century cargo ship while documenting marine life that had made the wreck their home over the past century. The experience was transcendent, being completely absorbed in work that genuinely excited me while surrounded by people who understood and shared that passion, feeling useful and valued for my actual skills rather than my willingness to fund someone else's lifestyle. That evening, our diving group gathered at a local restaurant to share stories about the day's discoveries, and I found myself laughing more genuinely than I had in years, participating in conversations about topics that actually mattered to me rather than pretending to be interested in celebrity gossip and social media drama that had dominated dinner conversations with Rachel. I realized that the opposite of love isn't hate but complete indifference, and that's exactly what I felt when I thought about Rachel and the artificial life we'd constructed together based on her materialistic values rather than any authentic compatibility or shared vision for the future we wanted to build together as genuine partners. The story ended with me surrounded by new friends who appreciated my expertise and calm presence, finally understanding that genuine happiness comes from being authentically yourself with people who value you for who you actually are, and that sometimes the best thing you can do for your emotional well-being is to honor someone's request to become invisible by making it permanent rather than temporary.